Now we will make a jump and go from Greece to Rome. It is traditionally thought that Rome made no contribution to the world of culture, nor to the world of the humanities, that Romans were pragmatic people who relied on the Greeks in everything, that with respect to culture, art, the plastic arts, architecture and sculpture, all the Romans did was copy the Greeks. The Romans contributed nothing. That is the official version. However, in the sphere of economics and the study of the spontaneous market order, the geniuses were the Romans, not the Greeks. The Greek thinkers did not understand the spontaneous market order. According to Aristotle, it is impossible to imagine a polis, a city, with more than 100,000 inhabitants, because it would be impossible to organize. So his philosophy is hierarchical. He believes in organizing things from above. He fails to understand the spontaneous market order, and this is a tragedy, because such philosophers were able to live without working, due to the great commercial prosperity the Greek world enjoyed, and the philosophers never understood. The honor of having first grasped the emergence of spontaneous orders which make civilization possible belongs to the Romans, specifically to the great jurisconsults of Rome, who theorized about the law and saw that it is an institution which emerges in an evolutionary fashion through the interaction of many human beings, none of whom consciously design it. The other day we discussed how Roman law discovered and outlined the ontological requirements of institutions like the deposit contract and the fundamental differences between them and the loan contract. Unfortunately, the documents we have on Roman banking activities are not as precise as those I have just cited from the Greek world, but we do have some information. For example, in the year 1844, on Mount Athos, a mountain that is home to the most important Orthodox monasteries in Greece, the discovery was made of some papyrus scrolls which tell the story of the failure of the Christian Callistus's bank. It is very interesting because Callistus ended up becoming Pope and a saint of the Catholic Church. Who has seen the movie Gladiator? Everyone has seen Gladiator. Well, let us recall the movie. We are talking about the same time period. The emperor Marcus Aurelius dies and leaves power to his crazy son, if in fact the son did not kill the father, as in the movie. The son's name is Commodus, and he loves to make himself out to be a gladiator. He even names a horse general. The poor guy is off his rocker. Well, Callistus was the slave of a famous banker in Rome. And I must make the following side note. The conditions of slaves in Rome were much less dreadful than you may think, or may have seen in movies or read in novels. The slaves in Rome had a very powerful incentive to act responsibly in favor of their masters, because they stood a good chance of being freed if they did. They gained their master's trust. They were industrious. Every 5 years, on the average, 10% of the slaves over the age of 25 were liberated. Do you know what the corresponding rate was in the case of the black slaves in the United States in the 19th century? 0.2%. It was very common for Roman masters to devote a large amount of effort and money to training and educating their slaves. The better educated a slave was, if he knew how to read and write, the rudiments of trade, etc., the more he was worth. In contrast, in the common law system in the United States, it was a crime to teach a slave to read and write, or to educate a slave, and masters faced heavy fines. In Rome, a slave could have his own personal peculium. The term peculium referred to a slave's earnings, and though they officially belonged to the master, the slave kept track of them and managed them himself, and the slave could then use this peculium to pay the cost of his liberation. So, slaves had a strong incentive to be productive and amass a peculium. They could help finance their liberation. In Rome, once a slave had been freed, he could climb the social ladder. It was not frowned upon for a noblewoman to marry a freed slave. Not only was it not frowned upon, it was an everyday occurrence, and vice versa. Members of the second or third generation could even be ennobled. Also, remember that when a slave was liberated in Rome, he or she became part of the gens, the family of the former master, and there were ties of solidarity in families, understood in the broad sense, which included children, grandchildren, cousins, slaves, and freed slaves. So, if a problem arose, people had to pitch in. A freed slave belonged to the family of the man who had freed him, or had freed his father, or had freed his grandfather, and he considered it an honor to belong to that family. And when the time came to lend a hand, he would lend a hand. One incentive masters had to liberate their slaves was that in doing so, they expanded the circle of people who could help them when things went wrong. So it should not surprise you that a master entrusted Callistus with the running of a banking business, and Callistus was a Christian. One of the most important business strategies is to divide up the market, and Callistus specialized in obtaining deposits from Christians. The banking business rests on trust, and if I am a Christian and you are a Christian banker, and I need someone to guard my money for me, I am going to give it to someone trustworthy who is also a Christian, and who therefore believes in Jesus Christ and is honest and will not appropriate the money. A good person who turns the other cheek when struck, who is not going to deceive, who is not going to lie, who is going to obey the commandments, who organizes his whole life around love of neighbor. Well, if you find a banker who makes this sales pitch to you, and the business rests on trust, then you have a strong incentive to use that bank. And in fact, Callistus was very successful from the commercial standpoint, and he obtained numerous deposits, mainly from widows and orphans in the Roman Christian community at that time. But not even Christians are free from temptation, and as the document found on Mount Athos explains, in certain circumstances, Callistus appropriated a substantial part of his depositors' money, and when they went to withdraw their deposits, the money was gone. Confidence collapsed, the bank failed, and it was a major scandal. The document tells us that Callistus fled. He even tried to commit suicide by jumping into the sea at the port of Ostia. And eventually he was detained and sentenced to hard labor in the salt mines in Sardinia. Dear students, that amounted to a death sentence, because the conditions of those sentenced to hard labor, the galleys or the mines, were so grim that on average a person could only survive 3, 4 or 5 years. But take note, it turns out that the Emperor Commodus had a mistress, a concubine, and the concubine was a Christian. And though Christians today are supportive and charitable, they were especially so then. And Marcia began to ask the emperor to pardon Callistus, and the Emperor Commodus pardoned Callistus before he died in the mines, and he was freed. Well, life is full of ups and downs, and a few decades later, Callistus became a model Christian and was elected Pope. And in a revolt against Christians, he was thrown alive into a well and killed, a martyr of the church, and made a saint. Saint Callistus I, the 17th Pope of the Catholic Church. And who would have thought that in his youth he had been a corrupt banker?